The SS Noronic was launched on June 2, 1913 in Port Arthur, Ontario. She was built by the Western Dry Dock and Shipbuilding Company for the Canada Steamship Lines. She was built for passenger and package freighter services on the Great Lakes. The Noronic had 5 decks and was 362 feet long in length and measured in at around 6,095 gross registered tons. She could hold up to 600 passengers and with a crew of 200. She was one of Canada's largest and most beautiful passenger ships at the time, and she was nicknamed the Queen of the Lakes. The Noronic's passenger decks were labeled A, B, C, and D, and none had a direct gangplank access to the dock. The only exits on the ship were located on the lowest deck, E deck. There were 2 gangplanks on the port side and 2 on the starboard side. Only 2 of them were operational at a time. The SS Noronic also had 8 fleetmate ships built. Their names were the City of Midland, Doric, Germanic, Ionic, Majestic, Wabic, Huronic, and Harmonic. Do forgive me if I said any of those incorrectly. Anyway, the Harmonic also burned up in 1945, and the Huronic was retired and scrapped in 1950. On September 14, 1949, the Noronic embarked on a 7-day pleasure cruise of Lake Ontario from Detroit, Michigan. She had departed from Detroit and picked up additional passengers at Cleveland, Ohio. From there, she was scheduled to travel to Prescott, Ontario, and the Thousand Islands before returning to Sarnia. There, she would have remained for over the remainder of winter. The Noronic was carrying 524 passengers at the time, and all but 20 of whom were American, and 171 crew members as well, all Canadian. The captain on the voyage was Captain William Taylor, and the Noronic docked for the night at the Pier 9 in Toronto Harbor at 7 p.m. on September 16th. At 2:30 a.m., passenger Don Church noticed smoke in the aft part of the starboard corridor on C deck. Church followed the smell of the smoke to a small room off the port corridor. It was just forward of a woman's washroom. In there, he found that the smoke was coming from a locked linen closet, and he notified the bellboy Ernest O'Neill of the fire. Without sounding the alarm, O'Neill ran to the steward's office on D deck to retrieve the keys to the closet. Once the closet was opened, the fire exploded into the hallway, and it spread quickly throughout the ship, fueled by the lemon-oiled polished wood paneling on the walls. Church and O'Neill and another bellboy and 1 other passenger attempted to fight the blaze with fire extinguishers. But without success, they were forced to retreat almost immediately by the spreading fires throughout the rest of the ship. To his dismay, O'Neill found the fire extinguishers to not be working. Church rushed to his stateroom on D deck and fled the ship with his wife and children. Meanwhile, O'Neill ran to the officers' quarters and then notified Captain Taylor. He also notified First Mate Gary Wood, and then sounded the ship's whistles to raise the alarm. At this point, it was 2:38 a.m., only 8 minutes after the initial fire had begun, but already half of the ship's decks were ablaze. 27-year-old Donald Williamson was the first rescuer on the scene at the Noronic. After working a late shift at a nearby Goodyear tire plant, the former lake freighter deckhand wanted to see the Noronic, which he knew was in port at that time. Williamson arrived to the sound of the ship's distress whistles as the fire quickly was spreading and people were frantically jumping into the lake. Spotting a large painter's raft nearby, he released it and pushed it into position near the ship's port bow. As people jumped from the burning ship, he pulled them in from the water to the safety of his raft. Responding to a routine box call, Toronto police constables Ronald Anderson and Warren Shattuck turned their car onto Queen's Quay in time to see the ship erupting in flames as high as the mast. Their cruiser was immediately surrounded by survivors, and many of whom were in shock. Some of these survivors were on fire. A passenger alerted Anderson to those in the water and those on the decks, some in flames. Anderson stripped his uniform off, jumped into the frigid, oily water, and began to assist Williamson on the raft. Fireboats began to join in the rescue operation as well, plucking others who had jumped into the water from the ship. Among those officers was Jack Marks, who went on to become Toronto's police chief. The Noronic's crew members had to smash portholes to drag some of its passengers out of their cabins. Moments before the whistle sounded, the pier's night watchman noticed the flames coming from the ship and contacted the Toronto Fire Department. A pumper truck, a hose wagon, a high-pressure truck, an aerial truck, a rescue squad, and the deputy chief and a fireboat were dispatched to the scene. Ambulances and police were also dispatched, and the first fire truck arrived at around 2:41 a.m. at the pier. By this time, the entire ship was consumed in flames. Only 15 crew members had been on the ship at the time when the fire had broken out, and they had failed to make a sweep of the upper 4 decks to wake passengers. Those who did wake up were awakened by screaming and running in the corridors. Most of the ship's stairwells were on fire, and few passengers were able to reach E-deck to escape down the gangplanks. Some passengers climbed down the ropes to the pier. The scene of the Noronic on fire was later described as one of great panic, with people jumping off the upper decks engulfed in flames, and some falling to their deaths on the pier below. Others were trampled to death in a mad rush in the corridors. Still, others suffocated or were burned alive, unable to exit their cabins. The screams of the dying were said to be audible even over the sounds of whistles and sirens. The first rescue ladder was extended to B deck. It was immediately rushed by passengers, causing the ladder to snap in two. The passengers were sent tumbling into the harbor, where they were rescued by a waiting fireboat. Other ladders extended to C deck and held firm throughout the entire rescue. After about 20 minutes, the metal hull of the Noronic was white hot, and the decks began to buckle and collapse onto each other. After an hour of fighting the blaze, the Noronic was so full of water from fire hoses that it listed severely toward the pier. This caused firefighters to retreat. The ship then righted itself, and firefighters were able to return to their original positions. By the end, more than 1.7 million gallons of water had been poured onto the ship from 37 hoses. The fire was finally put out by 5 a.m., and the wreckage was allowed to cool for 2 hours before the recovery of bodies begun. Searchers found a gruesome scene inside the burned-out hull. Firefighters reported that they had found charred and bracing skeletons in the corridors. Some were deceased passengers found still in their beds, while many were skeletons almost completely incinerated, resulting in forensic dentistry being reportedly used to identify remains for the first time. The glass on the Noronic had also melted from every window, and even steel fittings on the Noronic had warped and twisted from the intense heat. Every stairwell had been completely destroyed, save for one near the bow. The death toll from the disaster was never exactly determined. Some estimates range that anywhere from 118 to 139 people died on the Noronic. Most died from either suffocating or being burned to death. Some died from being trampled on or leaping off of the upper decks of the Noronic down onto the pier, crashing on it. There was only one person reported to have drowned. To the anger of many, all 118 of those initially killed were, unfortunately, passengers. One crew member, Louisa Dustin, had later died of her injuries. She was, in fact, the only Canadian victim and the 119th fatality. An inquiry was launched by the House of Commons to investigate the fire. It was determined to have started in the linen closet on C deck, but the cause exactly was never discovered. It was deemed likely that a cigarette was carelessly dropped by a member of the laundry staff. Company officials suspected arson as well. The very high death toll was blamed on the crew and its ineptitude, too few of whom were on duty at the time when the fire started, and none of whom attempted to wake the passengers. Also, a lot of crew members fled the ship when the alarm sounded, and no member of the crew ever called the fire department on their departures. The passengers had not been informed of the evacuation procedures or routines upon the Noronic. The design and construction of the Noronic, which was 36 years old at the time, were also found to be at fault. The interiors had been lined with oily wood instead of fireproof materials, and exits were only located on one deck instead of all five, and none of the ship's fire extinguishers were working. Captain Taylor was hailed as a hero in the weeks after the fire. During when it had broke out, he smashed windows, pulling trapped passengers from the rooms, and was among the last of the crew to leave the Noronic. However, the Canadian Department of Transport inquiry into the disaster blamed both Taylor and the Canada Steamship Lines for failing to take adequate precautions against the fire, and they ordered that Taylor's master's certificate be suspended for 1 year. A witness made an accusation that Taylor had been under the influence of alcohol at the time. However, Taylor denied this, and other witnesses testified that he was behaving normally. The SS Noronic, which settled to the bottom in shallow water, was partially taken apart at the scene after the fire. The upper decks were cut away, and the hull was refloated on November 29, 1949. It was then towed to Hamilton, Ontario, where it was eventually scrapped. Her sister ship, the smaller Noronic, was retired and scrapped in 1950. By 1967, the Canada Steamship Lines phased out its remaining passenger ships from the fleet. This was because of new international regulations relating to the ships containing wood and other flammable materials. Civil lawsuits for the Noronic were settled at just over $2 million. The Noronic's whistle is displayed in a nautical museum on Toronto's waterfront, and the Ontario Heritage Foundation placed a plaque near the site of the fire disaster on its 50th anniversary. I thank you everyone for joining me in this story of the SS Noronic. What a horrible tragedy, and a seemingly, lazy or possibly a situation that could have been avoided altogether. Then again, those were different times back then, but I don't know. It just seems like carelessness or poor design, or even not enough, like they said, crew members. alerting passengers to the tragedy and the terror that was unfolding on the ship. However, that's just my opinion. I did not know anything about this ship until researching on some shipwrecks on Lake Ontario. I know there are a lot more on Lake Michigan, especially Superior and Huron, but I did want to do a lesser, not a lesser lake, but I did want to do a shipwreck. Even though this ship did not sink in the lake, I did want to do a story on Lake Ontario for this one. So, however, that'll be it for this video, guys. I do very much enjoy your comments and your thoughts and opinions on these videos that I produce. I thank you so much for your patience in between each video. These do take time to put together and edit and everything that goes into it, but I do very much enjoy your support, and if you feel that I've earned a like or subscribe, please do at the bottom there. Otherwise, this has been Songs of the Great Lakes, and I look very much forward to the next video coming soon. Thank you guys, and God bless you.